Do you ever find yourself, when you're processing flax fibre to spin into lovely smooth linen, wishing that it didn't create quite so much waste fibre? Same. So today I'm going to show you how I take waste or flax tow and turn it into usable fibre. And in so doing, I'm going to chat a little bit about flax and its uses and my possibly slightly unconventional methods for using it. So if you're not familiar, flax is the fibre that turns into linen. It is a plant fibre, and I have some not quite unprocessed flax here, but this is a bundle of flax stems. So the roots are at this end, and then this end is where the seed heads were before they were removed. So flax goes through various processes to turn it into usable fibre, and ideally you want those fibres to be the full length, or almost the full length, of the stem of the plant. So you want really nice, long, smooth fibres that will give a nice, cool, strong fabric. So first, the seed heads are removed by a process called rippling, and there's a break in this where I've had it folded in half just for storage. I've got some seed heads just here. They're quite pretty, but you don't want the seed heads for fibre uses, and you can kind of see here where some of these fibres have started breaking and turning into the fibres that we want to use. So flax has a sort of brittle bark on the outside of the stems. So these bits here. Processing flax is mostly to remove these bits and reveal the nice wispy fibres inside. So in traditional flax processing, the first process is rippling, which I mentioned, to take the seeds off the tops of the stems. Then you would use a breaker of some sort, which, sort of the clue's in the name, breaks these long stems into shorter pieces so they're easier to remove. Next, the fibre is scutched, where you use a long, smooth piece of wood to kind of flake those broken bits of bark off the fibre. Then, after scutching, it is put through hackles quite a few times. So hackles they can be quite sophisticated combs, but generally, historically, they would have been quite long nails pointing upwards out of a piece of wood, which the fibre is sort of flung through and combed out to remove the remaining bits of bark and to separate out the little fibres to get as fine a fibre as possible. So hopefully you will be taking long stems like this and turning it into beautiful, smooth fibres that can then be spun into yarn and then usually woven. Flax is better suited for weaving because, unlike wool, it has no elasticity to it. It's a very firm, strong fibre, and so it is better suited to weaving rather than knitting. And so you've got these lovely long fibres, but the byproduct is this, which is the tow. And this has its tangled bits, it's got broken bits of bark in it, and it sort of more resembles straw than anything you'd actually want to spin with. And this is what I've been working with to try and get some usable fibre, because spinning long fibres like this requires a distaff, which is a setup next to your spinning wheel to keep the fibres aligned and straight and make sure they don't get tangled, so you can yield a really strong, smooth yarn that's very consistent. But that's a particular spinning style that I don't actually enjoy that much. And so these broken fibres are kind of an opportunity to use what is effectively a waste product and turn it into something that I prefer working with. So traditionally, linen processing is a very arduous process. It's difficult to mechanize, but linen fabrics were used, at least in Europe, ubiquitously for centuries. They were used for the layers of clothing that we've worn against the skin. It's a very hard wearing fibre and quite easy to launder. And then wool would be worn on top. Wool is slightly more difficult to wash, and so the linen layers would protect the wool from skin and the associated things. So these days, it's very difficult to firstly process the linen into fibres this long, and secondly, once you've got fibres this long, it's very difficult to spin in an efficient way. Modern spinning machines can't really cope with fibre lengths this long. Some of them can. They are quite specialised equipment, and they are much less efficient than the kinds of machines used for spinning things like wool and cotton, which are much shorter fibres and easier to work with. So often these days, flax fibres are cut down into shorter lengths and then processed more like cotton, which gives a fabric that is not the same quality as you would have had however many years ago. But in this case, we are using shorter fibres deliberately to avoid waste. So traditionally, fibre like this, rather than going through further processing, like the difficult bits that have a lot of broken bits or haven't been properly retted, so that's the process of leaving the stalks out in the rain and dew to sort of break down that outer bark. It breaks down what connects the bark to the fibre itself, and that makes it easier to remove. If that process goes too far, then the fibres themselves that you want to use will break. If you don't ret the fibres enough, then it becomes very difficult to remove the bark. So sometimes you get fibres that haven't been retted properly and so won't separate out nicely, so they're a bit coarser. As far as I know, fibre like this, rather than processing it further, would often be used in things like upholstery and padding, when people used to wear padding to modify the shape of their bodies so that their clothes would give that historical silhouette. Often flax tow was used to pad various areas sewn within a casing. The tow can be processed further, and historically that was seen as cloth made from flax tow was seen as an inferior cloth. And so if you see someone described in older literature wearing clothing made of tow, then it's generally an indication that they were unable to access finer fabrics. That's a bit of a rant. So we're going to assume that we're starting with this tow fibre. I'm not going to be processing this today. That is a job for another day, because I am almost through this latest batch of tow. And I'm just going to show you quickly how I take it from something quite unpleasant to fibre that, while still imperfect, is going to be usable. So flax processing is messy work. You can see I've already made a lot of mess here. And so the only tool I'm going to be using is a single hand carder. These are traditionally used for wool fleece, for a woolen preparation, but they work quite nicely as a sort of miniature hackle. A hackle, again, being the kind of comb used to comb out and separate the flax fibres. So firstly, this is in a sort of bundle. Some of the fibres are aligned a little bit. What I generally do is I just start gently teasing them apart. And this won't straighten them out completely because there will be some bits in there that are bent back on themselves. But this just helps to align the fibres slightly. And if we can get them parallel, then we can preserve as much length of the fibre as we can. I'm going to take quite a small bundle and just flick it across the carder. And I'm holding the fibre sort of along the middle of its length. And then once that is combed out smooth, turn it round and do the same on the other side. And the more times the fibre passes through the carder, the finer it'll become. But also the more likely it is, as well as splitting along its length to yield a finer fibre, it is then more likely to break midway along, and so you end up with shorter fibres. So then that nice smooth bit we can put aside. This, again, these fibres are likely to be shorter and coarser. As I go, I'm just going to pick out bits of bark and any particularly knotted, neppy bits. Neps are where the fibre sort of snarls up on itself and forms a little knot. And then we just go again grasping it at the midpoint and switching round once it's combed out. And you can see there, the first pass through the carders yields longer fibres, and the second pass the fibres are a little bit shorter. And as we keep doing this, you end up with shorter and shorter, softer and softer fibres. So I usually end up categorizing these into little bundles so that I can use them for different projects. These are similar enough in length to the previous lot, so I'm just going to put those together. And then this is the point where we're kind of reaching diminishing returns, because the fibres are just going to get shorter and shorter, and it becomes more and more work to yield fibre that is usable. So at this point, I usually go through and pick out the more egregiously coarse bits, which end up looking a bit more like horsehair or something. And then we've just got a little bundle of quite soft, but with occasional wild bits of flax. So then these are the 3 little bundles we've just processed. And in this particular lot, we didn't have any really long fibres which go into a bundle that looks like this. These ones I usually tie up just to prevent them from getting tangled. And these ones, again, they're long enough that you'd probably need a distaff to process them. And then we've got shorter ones, and it can depend on sort of the batch of tow you're working with as to how it was processed, how much breakage there was, and so the sorts of lengths you're going to get. And those are my really nice long ones. And then these, that's the stuff we haven't processed yet there. And then I have these little separated out piles for different states of flax. So these are some of the longest ones of these shorter fibres. So this bundle I've just made here is still a bit short for that, but probably fits in nicely with this little bundle here. So I'll put that in there, and then these ones can go in these shorter ones here, and then this pile is sort of, well, it's a bit shorter than this pile. And these ones are ones that have been broken down a bit further, and so they're beginning to look quite fluffy. And so this fibre I think matches this well. So that can just go on that heap. And then I also have a big heap here of fibre that has been processed even further. And I've used 2 hand cards. And that's really fluffy fibre. And this is the kind of fineness you're actually looking for from a nice flax fibre, but these have been processed so far that the fibres are so much shorter. But these are going to be lovely to either card up on their own, or as I intend to use them, to blend with wool. So the fibres of these sorts of lengths can quite happily be spun on their own. I could easily sort of draft this out into like a top kind of preparation to spin. I wouldn't need to worry about a distaff to keep these under control, because that's a similar length to a lot of long wools, so breeds of sheep that have longer fleeces. So that would be able to be spun just like that. But then, yeah, these shorter fluffy bits and these ones and the aligned fluffy bits I'm going to use in a project where I blend them with naturally dyed wool, and I'll be blending them on a drum carder, but you could work with them with hand cards if that is what you have available. If you are used to using hand cards, you can process them like this, you can turn them into little fluffy rolags, you can blend them up or spin them on their own. And it is a much more manageable way of working with the fibre, which kind of mimics how commercial flax is often processed these days, where it's broken into shorter lengths to make it easier to process. So it won't have the really like long, smooth, strong properties that linen is often prized for, but it will add a bit of coolness and breathability to a wool yarn. And it'll also, if you have it all tangled up like this and spun into yarn that way rather than in a traditional smooth worsted way, it will give a yarn that has a little bit more body and less crispness to it than a traditional, very smooth linen yarn. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting to work further with this fibre once I've finished processing this last little bundle. and I will catch you next time for when I take this project further. And if you have any questions, please do let me know. I'm not an expert on flax, but it's something I'm learning more about. There is exciting stuff happening in the British flax industry, and yeah, it's nice that it's seeing a bit of a resurgence.